Well, it is 10 o'clock, so in interest of time, we will get started. First of all, good morning, and thank you everyone for joining us today for the Pump Up the Support webinar. We are thrilled to have you join us as we dive into the importance of creating breastfeeding-friendly workplaces. Just the first few couple housekeeping items. My name is Christine Cunard. I am one of the nurses at Brown County Public Health. This webinar is being recorded and can be viewed for after the session. If you have any concerns with that, please let us know. If you're able to, please add your name and the organization that you are representing today into the chat, that would be wonderful. And then about the last 10-15 minutes or so of the webinar today is reserved for questions. So if you do have any questions as we are going through the webinar and presentation today, please put them in the chat. If for some reason, because Teams can be a little goofy, if you can't put it in the chat, there is the Q&A function as well, and we will check both places for questions at the end. So first, I would like to introduce our first speaker. That is Corey Walton. Corey has been with the U.S. Department of Labor and Wage Hour Division since 1997. He has spent 15 years as an investigator, investigating hundreds of cases under several different laws, which include the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Family Medical Leave Act, and other laws that are enforced by the Wage and Hour Division. Over the last 12 years, Corey has served as the Community Outreach and Resource Planning Specialist in the Wage and Hour Minneapolis District Office. In that capacity, Corey spends most of his time organizing and conducting U.S. Department of Labor education and training events throughout states of Wisconsin and Minnesota. So we are very pleased to welcome Corey here today. So Corey, take it away.
Thanks, Christine. Thank you, Becky, and everyone for coming to the webinar. Every time I hear my bio, I feel that much older. Every single time I hear my bio, it puts like 2 or 3 years on me. So, but anyway, thanks again, everyone. I'm gonna share my screen so we can get started because I got a lot of juicy stuff I want to cover with you guys. But just as a background, and Christine covered most of this. I operate out of the Minneapolis district office here in Minneapolis, but our district office here in Minnesota covers both states, Wisconsin and Minnesota. So I do outreach, education, and training on federal laws in both Wisconsin and Minnesota. We're an enforcement agency, so most of our resources or most of our personnel or staff are enforcement, but we also have outreach efforts. And a lot of our investigators and myself do a lot of outreach, education, and training so we can prevent things from going wrong in the first place before we even reach the enforcement part of it. So that's why I'm here. I want to educate everyone on these requirements. I'm going to turn off my camera for my presentation. I'll turn it back on afterwards during the Q&A just to answer any questions you guys might have. But without further ado, I'm going to get started. The break time for nursing mothers requirements under federal law are included in the Fair Labor Standards Act. So that act was amended in 2010. So these provisions are roughly 14 years old to include these requirements of time and space. So that's where it comes from. It's not its own separate law, and I'll talk about the Pump Act in a little bit, but under the FLSA, that's where you'll find these provisions that require time and place for the employer to provide for employees that need to express milk at work. And then that third bullet you see, or sub-bullet, is it says for up to 1 year. So the requirements that I'm going to talk about are in place for a 1 year after the birth of the child. After that point, then these provisions go away for that employee. So that's the period we're talking about, 1 year up to after the birth of the child. So when we get calls and we do presentations and answer questions about the nursing mothers provisions, one of the first questions we get is, who does it apply to? Which employees are eligible to take the time or to provide the space and time for? So there's 2 types of coverage under the Fair Labor Standards Act. There's enterprise coverage, and then there's individual coverage. In other words, if an employee is entitled to these protections under the nursing mothers requirements, they're either going to be entitled to them because the whole company is covered by the FLSA. Again, the FLSA is the law that includes these provisions, or the individual employee, depending on what she's doing, is going to be entitled to these protections. So enterprise coverage or individual coverage. I'm gonna cover both of those approaches separately. So first, enterprise coverage, because this is the easy one. So this is the blanket. You can look at it like a blanket coverage. So once this applies, once the FLSA applies enterprise-wide, then any employee, any work week, any location are going to be entitled to the time and place protections on the nursing mother's provision. So it's a simple two-pronged test too, by the way. That's why I say it's the simple one. So if the employer, if the company has at least, and these are those two sub bullets you see on the slide, if the employer has at least two employees, A, and B, if the employer grosses at least $500,000, $500,000 annually, if both of those things are true, then that employer is going to be covered enterprise-wide by the FLSA, meaning in any work week, any location, any employee is going to be entitled to the nursing mother's requirements. Okay, two-pronged test, two employees, $500,000 a year. That's it. Also, within this enterprise coverage test is this component called named enterprises. So there are certain types of businesses simply because they operate in certain industries, they too will be covered enterprise wide by the FLSA. And so we're talking schools, we're talking any government agency at any level, local, state, county, federal, they too will be covered, as will facilities providing nursing care for the aged or the infirm, like a nursing home or a group home or assisted living facility, obviously a hospital. So those types of establishments, those named enterprises, schools, government agencies, care facilities, they're going to be covered by the FLSA. Again, anyone working for those types of businesses are going to be protected by the nursing mothers provisions. That's the enterprise test. But let's say it's a smaller company that doesn't gross at least $500,000. And let's say they're not one of those named enterprises. It's not a school, it's not a government agency, or it's not a care facility. It's still possible that individual employees working for the employer would still be able will still be protected by the FLSA Nursing Mothers protections. Let me give you a good example, a quick example. Let's say if it's a restaurant and the restaurant doesn't gross at least $500,000. Let's say it grosses $400,000. Obviously, it's not one of those named enterprises. It's not a hospital or a care facility or a school or a government agency. But let's say you have, Jan and Mary are two employees of the restaurant, right? And they're hosts. They're hosts of the restaurant and they swipe credit cards on a regular basis. Well, they're involved in what we call or part of their daily routine involves interstate commerce activities. Swiping that credit card is an interstate commerce activity because the information, once you swipe that card, crosses state lines. It goes to New York or California or whatever. So those two employees, while not working for a restaurant that's covered enterprise wide, but they're engaged in interstate commerce activities, so they too would be subject to the protections. Other examples of interstate commerce activities that are common: sending emails back and forth across state lines. So if someone's working for a small employer, but they're doing that on a regular basis, or ordering goods from out of state, or crossing back and forth across state lines, or sending letters, emails, etc. All of those interstate commerce activities, which would bring those types of workers doing those types of things under the FLSA umbrella and under those protections. And then the last dash that you see on the slide there, it says virtually all employees engaged in agriculture are covered by the FLSA, in which case they too would be subject to the protections. So agriculture employees as well. I'm not sure if we have an agriculture employer on the in this session, but it's good to know that if you're an agriculture employer, that you're going to be subject to those protections as well and those requirements. Okay. If you don't remember anything, this is probably the best takeaway from my slide deck. Time and space. So these nursing mothers requirements can pretty much be summed up or summarized in requirements for time and requirements for space. I'm going to go through both of those big chunks, those big blocks. That's what you should remember because that's what this is all about. Let's go through time first. And how does that work? Employers required to provide time. The employer is required to provide reasonable break time, duration, each time, frequency an employee has a need to express milk. So we're talking duration and we're talking frequency. So let's start with duration. Reasonable break time. How long does it have to be if you're an employer? How long do you have to give the employee? Well, the Department of Labor starts with the 15 to 20-minute mark. So that's where we start. So an investigator looking at something like this would say whether or not the employer provided reasonable break time. They're going to start with 15 to 20 minutes. Now, that's not etched in stone. So, for example, factors that we would consider that might change that 15, 20 minutes is how far does the employee have to walk from the workstation to where they are keeping the pump and equipment and to where they will express the milk and then back afterwards. The pump quality is another factor. So not all pumps are created equal. So some pumps are slower, some pumps are faster. So depending on pump quality, that kind of thing. And then where are they going to store the milk afterwards? Is that going to be someplace far away? Is it right around the corner? Is it close to where they work? So all of these kind of factors are going to impact whether or not 15 to 20 minutes sounds reasonable, a reasonable break time. And then they'll reach a conclusion. The second thing is each time. So frequency, how often, how many breaks, how many of these break time for nursing mother breaks does the employer have to provide to the employee? Again, starting from, this is our starting point, 2 to 3 breaks per 8-hour shift. That's where we start. That could change, depends on factors. And some of the factors that we would weigh would include the age of the baby. What's the baby's normal feeding schedule? Is the baby on solid foods yet? Et cetera, et cetera. And there's more. So again, both of these duration and frequency, we have something in our minds when we start, but we also consider, we understand that's not etched in stone, and we have to consider other factors, and that's exactly what we do. And there's a reminder that last sentence, this is for up to 1 year after the birth of the child. Again, these protections last for just 1 year. Some more time questions we get. So one question we get a lot is under federal law, are the employers, and this is the first bullet, are the employers required to provide compensation during these break times? So do the employees need to be paid for the compensation, whether it's 15, 20 minutes or whatever? And the answer is no under federal law, but there's two exceptions to that. I shouldn't call them exceptions, but there's two situations where the employees should be paid. And the first exception is the second bullet. And it says with other breaks under the FLSA, the employee must be completely relieved from duty or the break time must be compensated. So if the employee, for example, is expressing milk, but they're on a conference call at the same time, that's not completely relieved from duty, or they're answering questions on the phone or whatever. They have to be completely relieved from duty. Otherwise, they have to be paid for that time. They're on company time. And the second set of circumstances under which an employee should be paid for the time is this is I'm going to paint a picture, and this is the best way to explain this. So let's say an employer has a mid-afternoon and a mid-morning break policy that the employer provides like 15-minute breaks, paid breaks, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. Well, if the employee chooses to use that time to express milk, then they should be paid just like anybody else on a paid break, doing whatever they're doing on their smartphone or whatever. So if they choose to use paid breaks provided by the employer, now it's not required from a DOL standpoint that paid breaks, those types of breaks that I just described, be given. But if they are and they're paid breaks and the employee chooses to use those breaks to express milk, then they should be paid for that time as well. So generally speaking, break time is unpaid, but there are a couple of circumstances that employers should be aware of, where employees could be paid for that time. That's time. Remember, I said time and space. Now I'm going to shift to space. And what are the requirements related to nursing mother's space? This is pretty clear. Those first three bullets, the employer shall the place that the employer provides for the employee to express milk has to be something other than a bathroom. So a bathroom is not acceptable under federal law right off the bat. The space also has to have two features. Number one, this is the second bullet there. It has to be shielded from view. And number two, the third bullet there, free from intrusion from coworkers and the public. Shielded from view, free from intrusion. So shielded from view ideally would be a room with, if there's windows, they should be covered up. And that would be like the ideal situation. Obviously, every employers are different, and what they can provide varies from employer to employer. But that would be like I said, the ideal situation. As far as free from intrusion, again, a room with a door that locks, that would be the ideal situation. But sometimes that's not always possible. Maybe a space, like you see in that picture there, a space, as long as it's shielded from view, but a space that might have a sign that says keep out or something like that. That would hopefully take care of the intrusion problem. So sometimes, a lot of times, not just sometimes, a lot of times, depending on the industry, employers have to be creative when they come up with recommendations or trying to provide these accommodations to the nursing mother employee. Again, the third bullet just says it has to be a space that they can express milk in. Second paragraph there, an employer may temporarily designate a space or make a space available when needed by the employee. Let's stop there. I'm going to kind of try to explain what temporary designate. I think you guys probably know what that means, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a room or space that's available 24/7. So in other words, not a room dedicated exclusively for nursing mothers activities. It has to be available each time an employee needs it, but it can be used for other purposes at other times. And then I'll continue reading that paragraph. The location must be functional as a space for expressing milk. So what does functional mean under federal law? Under federal law, functional means three things. Number one, there has to be a place to sit other than the floor for the employee. The second thing, there has to be a flat surface on which the employee can place the pump and equipment, etc., other than the floor. And number three, ideally, there should be an electrical outlet. So place to sit other than a floor, flat surface on which to place the pump and equipment. And ideally, there should be an electrical outlet if that's needed. So that's what functional means. And again, this space or this room doesn't have to be available 365 days out of the year around the clock, but it has to be available when it's needed. Some additional issues to consider. I'm going to skip the first bullet because I think I've driven that point home. The second bullet says space at adjacent to restaurants like a locker room or lounge area. That can suffice as long as it's free from intrusion, shielded from view, and can be used, and it's functional, can be used to express milk. So it satisfies those three functional requirements as well. Dual use rooms, I kind of alluded to this earlier. Rooms that are used for other purposes at other times, that's fine. A manager's office, I think the regulations uses that as an example. But the point is, it can be used for other purposes when it's not needed. Fourth bullet, storage of milk and pumps. So under the regulations, it's not required that the employer provide a refrigerator for the milk. But if the employee, for example, brings a insulated container to keep in which to keep the milk during her shift, then the employer must provide a space or some place that that milk can be stored during her shift. And not only the insulator, but also the equipment, the pump equipment should be a place or space that can be stored during the shift as well. And then that last bullet, notice, and that pretty much the idea behind that is that the employer and the employee should be sharing the responsibilities for making sure things are in compliance. And by that, I mean, if the employee, for example, is pregnant and she expects to express milk at work once the baby arrives, then maybe notify the employer ahead of time so the employer, he or she, can make the necessary arrangements. And the flip side of that, if the employer wants to inquire whether or not the employee plans to express milk once the baby arrives, the employer can inquire about that. And then that way he or she can make the necessary accommodations ahead of time. So that notice, kind of the employee and the employer working together to make sure things are in place when they need to be. Undue hardship. So there are some small employers. The department recognizes that sometimes, it's tough, especially for like really small employers. It might be a challenge to provide to be in compliance or to provide the space and time, especially to key personnel if you're a real small company. So there is this undue hardship defense. And that first bullet off to the left kind of summarizes what that defense is. So any employer that employs fewer than 50 employees is not required to provide break time and space if it would pose an undue hardship. Now, two things about this undue hardship defense. The first thing is the second bullet right underneath there. That 50 employee test is enterprise wide. It's not an establishment test. It's a company test. So if you, for example, an employer has 3 locations with 20 employers at each location, the employer does not get to claim the undue hardship at each location because each location has fewer than 50 employees. The employer has 60 employees, so they wouldn't be able to claim the undue hardship because they would have more than 50. And the second thing I want to say about the undue hardship defense is the next bullet, the last bullet on the top right-hand side. Um, the undue hardship is not automatic. So the employer has to show things. And so I'm just going to read the third bullet. Undue hardship is defined as causing the employer significant difficulty or expense when considered in relation to the size, financial resources, nature, or structure of the employer's business. So these are the things that must be demonstrated to the Department of Labor to show us that, yeah, the undue hardship defense here applies. So the employer would not have to provide the time and the space. So it's not automatic. It doesn't automatically click in for every employer that has fewer than 50 employees. The employer actually has to demonstrate those things using those elements in that third paragraph. Okay, so a little over 2 years ago, um, Congress passed the PUMP Act, the Providing Urgent Maternal Protections for Nursing Mothers Act, or the PUMP Act, and it became effective early the next year. So there's a couple of things I want to point out in the PUMP Act that really impacted the employers and the employees as far as these nursing mothers protections. Um, Remedies and the number of employees who the nursing mothers protections covered. So one of the things the Pump Act did was expanded coverage to the employees. In other words, more employees were protected by these nursing mothers provisions. And these are the employees that were brought under the umbrella with that Pump Act enactment. Agricultural workers, obviously, that's a big swath. Nurses, teachers, truck drivers and taxi drivers, home care workers, and managers. So all of these employees or types of workers were exempt or weren't included in the protections prior to the Pump Act, and now they are. So that's the big thing that the Pump Act did. The second thing the Pump Act did, and I don't have a slide for this, I don't think, but I'll just talk about it, is it expanded the types of remedies that were available if violations occurred under the provisions. So some of the remedies now that are available, and this is a case by case, it depends on the circumstances of the case, but lost wages, if, for example, someone was fired in response for exercising their rights, liquidated damages, if that's appropriate, compensatory damages, punitive damages, if they were fired or reinstatement. So those are the kind of remedies that are available. Again, it just depends on the circumstances of the case. These remedies are not always going to apply, but when they do, they're there now as a result of the Pump Act. So expanding coverage and then the remedies, those two components are the two I wanted to touch on as far as the Pump Act. So that's the nursing mothers provisions. I want to shift gears, you guys, and go to, oh, by the way, I promised I was going to do this and I didn't. So right when I get done, I'm going to drop some links, some really good links to resources on the Pump Act and on the law that I'm about to briefly talk about now, the Family Medical Leave Act. So have no fear. There's going to be a fact sheet. There's going to be a couple of websites, a telephone number. You'll definitely have the resources you need because I did go through much of that pretty fast, but so sometimes you need to like go back and look at the resources and let stuff marinate. So you'll have the links to do that. So I want to shift gears and talk about the Family Medical Leave Act, which is a completely different, separate law. And if you, I think you guys are probably familiar with laws and how they work. So the way this FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, works is a different method for coverage. So FLSA, we talked about two employees, $500,000 or individual coverage. So that's just for the FLSA. So the Family Medical Leave Act is a different law. And the reason why I wanted to talk about it, because it's so closely tied to employees who would exercise their rights under the nursing mothers provision. So employers compliant with the nursing mothers provisions probably need to know, making sure they're in compliance with the Family Medical Leave Act, because those two acts are closely tied. So the Family Medical Leave Act, how does that work? So who's covered by it? And I'll talk a little bit about the provisions in a second. But employers right off the bat, this is the first chunk, the first third of the slide, employer coverage. Employers with 50 or more employees, public agencies, and public and private elementary and secondary schools. There's a lot more to the FMLA than on this screen as far as coverage, eligibility, and the employees who can take FMLA. But you'll have the resources. There's an employer and employee guide to the FMLA. But I'm just going to do like a quick overview, and then if you want to read up on it, you'll be able to. So that's how coverage works. So that's the employers, the type of employers who are subject to the FMLA. By the way, public agencies in the public and private elementary and secondary schools, there is no 50 employee test for them, just for the private employers. So if you're a public agency, for example, say you're a local sheriff's office, for example, and you got like 10 employees or something like that, you're going to be subject to the FMLA simply because you are a public agency. So there is no 50 employee test. That's just for the private employers. Second chunk there, who's eligible to take FMLA leave? So they have to work for one of those employers described in that first chunk, so a covered employer. The employee had to have worked at least 12 months for the employee for for the employer. And that doesn't necessarily have to be consecutive. There can be a break in employment. And then the third bullet there, the employee had to have worked at least 1,250 hours in the 12 months preceding the leave for leave. That's roughly about 24 hours a week. So part-time employees would also be eligible if they meet the requirements. And then that uh, fourth bullet there under the employee eligibility section, it says employee at a work site with 50 employees within a 75-mile radius. That's a different 50 employee test than the 50 employee test for employers to be covered. So they both use the 50 employee, but it's a different test. And then finally, who's eligible? I'm sorry, what type of leave or whether the reasons employees can take FMLA leave. And the first one is the reason why I think FMLA is so relevant for you guys. And it says for the birth or placement of a child for adoption. So just, there's different types of leave now that's available as ordinances, local ordinances, as state leave, et cetera. But I just kind of want to put the Family Medical Leave Act back on everyone's radar because that's a leave that does allow employees to take time off for the birth or placement of a child for adoption. The other two reasons, of course, the employee's own serious health condition or the serious health condition of a family member. Again, this is just an overview. I'll definitely have some resource links that you guys can use to get more into this. Finally, and I just want to concentrate on this again, that's one of the three buckets of qualifying reasons to take FMLA for the birth or placement of a child for adoption or foster care. Generally speaking, not generally speaking, but FMLA, the entitlement is 12 work weeks a year of leave. So, that can be chopped up for different purposes, of course, but in general, FMLA is going to be unpaid leave. There are circumstances in which that unpaid leave can turn into paid leave. Again, that's going to be in the resources that I give you, but as a general notion, FMLA is going to be unpaid leave. And I guess I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you guys want me to provide the slide deck afterwards, a PDF copy at least. But if so, these links will be in it. But I'll also put the links in the chat box. And I'm gonna stop myself right there. I can get carried away talking because it's 10:30. I want to make sure we stay on program. So I'll stop sharing, Becky, and drop those links in the chat box. Oops, Christine, I mean. Oops, are you muted, Christine?
That I am. Thank you. Great catch.
Welcome.
So thank you so much, Corey, for sharing all of that very valuable information. I feel every time I listen to different talks you've given, I always pick up on a new piece. So thank you so much, Corey, for your sharing all of your wonderful knowledge with us. Just wanted to add, if you have not put your name and organization you represent in the chat yet, that would be great, kind of as we're switching over here. And then Corey put some wonderful links in the chat. And again, that's always very helpful. And we'll send those out too as well. And now we'll switch over to Becky, a public health nurse here at Brown County. Take it away, Becky.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to do the same as Corey, and I'm going to turn my camera off during the presentation just for any lag that may occur. So hello all, and thank you, Corey, for going into details about the rights of pregnant and parenting employees. For my presentation, I'll take it to a more local level and focus on practical steps and strategies to help businesses of all sizes create a supportive environment for breastfeeding employees. So a little bit about me. So I have been a public health nurse with Brown County Public Health since 2017, and I specialize in maternal and child health. Here I have led initiatives to support breastfeeding families, including developing breastfeeding-friendly workplace programs and conducting a community-based infant feeding survey. I'm also a certified lactation counselor, or CLC for short, and former labor and delivery nurse. I was born and raised in Green Bay. I'm also a full-time working mother to a 2-year-old for whom I exclusively pumped breast milk for over a year. This picture on the slide is of my little girl a couple days after I returned back to work from maternity leave. So challenges faced by Brown County residents. So in 2024, Brown County conducted the Building a Bridge for Support survey supported by the Department of Health Services State Physical Activity and Nutrition Funding, or SPAN for short. Altogether, we had 329 pregnant or postpartum parents in Brown County respond. The workplace was the #1 place where participants felt a lack of support for breastfeeding. It was also the #3 reason people stopped breastfeeding, following they did not make enough milk and experienced pain while breastfeeding. Based off of these responses from our residents, the next step of our work is targeted interventions aimed at improving workplace support for breastfeeding families in Brown County, focusing on creating policies and resources that provide ongoing assistance and accommodations beyond the early postpartum period. So here are just a couple of quotes I picked out from our survey. I'll just give everybody a few moments to look over them. Okay, so let's take a real life example. So I recently spoke with Mary, a mother to a beautiful 5-month-old baby, who shared her struggles with balancing breastfeeding and work. Mary had the goal to continue breastfeeding her baby until she was at least 1 year of age because she decided that was best for her and her baby. She returned to her job just 6 weeks after having her baby, determined to continue breastfeeding. However, her workplace didn't have a dedicated lactation space. Her only option was to pump in a storage closet. The closet was uncomfortable and lacked a lock, so she was constantly worried about being interrupted. On top of that, her breaks weren't consistent, and she felt guilty about asking for time to pump because some coworkers and even her supervisor didn't seem to understand her needs. She overheard comments from her coworkers like, "I didn't see why she gets extra breaks. It's not fair to the rest of us. Can't you just do that at home? And must be nice to sit out while the rest of us are working." The remarks made her feel judged and guilty for taking care of her baby's needs. After weeks of stress, feeling like a burden, and feeling unsupported, she ended up weaning her baby earlier than planned. She said the experience made her feel undervalued as both an employee and as a mother. Stories like Mary's remind us why creating breastfeeding-friendly workplaces is so important. And then today we'll explore practical steps workplaces can take to ensure that employees feel supported and valued to continue breastfeeding while balancing their work responsibilities. So first, we will start with why breastfeeding is important. So breastfeeding is the optimal source of nutrition for infants, providing essential nutrients and antibodies that protect growth and development. It reduces the risk of infections, chronic diseases, and obesity in children, while lowering mothers' risk of breast and ovarian cancers, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, and postpartum depression. Beyond health benefits, breastfeeding has significant economic and societal impacts, including reduced healthcare costs, improved workplace productivity, and stronger family bonds. Supporting breastfeeding helps create healthier communities and empowers parents to give their children the best possible start in life. Supporting employees that are breastfeeding improves their health and well-being and also enhances overall productivity and job satisfaction. Today, parents with children are the fastest growing segment of the workforce. Nearly 55% of women with children under the age of 3 are employed. In Brown County, more than 75% of new parents choose to breastfeed. Creating a breastfeeding-friendly workplace benefits both employees and employers. It supports nursing parents by reducing stress and enabling a smoother transition back to work, leading to higher job satisfaction and loyalty. For employers, this translates into increased employee retention, reduced absenteeism due to healthier parents and children, and lower healthcare costs. Additionally, fostering a supportive environment improves morale and productivity while positioning the organization as a family-friendly workplace, enhancing its reputation and competitiveness. So Corey went into these, so I'll kind of just briefly go over them, but there are some federal requirements, and Corey went into far more detail than I will, but there's the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Pump Act for nursing mothers, and then for state requirements, we do have Wisconsin State Statute 253.165, which is the right to breastfeed. Basically gives people the right to breastfeed anywhere they want to. So let's say out in public, somebody's breastfeeding, they have the right to that. Nobody has the right to go up to them and tell them that they need to cover up. So how can we help you at Brown County Public Health? To help support our employers, Brown County Public Health is offering the Brown County Breastfeeding Friendly Workplace Program. Our program supports employers in creating breastfeeding-friendly workplaces by offering guidance on policies, lactation spaces, and employee support. These efforts will help businesses comply with legal requirements, enhance employee well-being, and foster a family-friendly environment. To become recognized as a breastfeeding-friendly workplace, the workplace must meet all the steps, which is our little acronym for support, time, education, policy, and space. And then Brown County Public Health will support you through each of these steps. And we'll go into more details for each one. So for support, the employer must provide opportunities for breastfeeding employees to receive support and encouragement. Examples could be message boards, internal workplace support groups, or something as simple as just providing information about local breastfeeding supports. We have here at Brown County Public Health a reference guide of infant feeding resources that would help you meet this step. So time. So employer must provide a work schedule and work pattern flexibility to accommodate reasonable break times for breastfeeding employees to express milk or breastfeed as needed for 1 year or longer after a child's birth. So milk expression varies per individual, as Corey kind of went over. Typically, it takes around 15 minutes plus the time it takes to get to and from the lactation space. Typically, milk expression is required every 3 hours, which amounts to 2 to 3 breaks throughout an 8-hour shift. And then break frequency and time should be individualized to meet the needs of the employee. For education, employers must be able to describe how they ensure that all employees are familiar with the employer's breastfeeding policy, how employees are referred, educated on community resources when requested, and train all supervisors to support breastfeeding. That could be as simple as they're aware of the policy and where to send employees when they ask about resources. So for policy, workplaces must have a written policy or guideline that is routinely shared with staff and addresses the elements of support, time, education, and space. The policy format should follow other guidance provided by employees. This may mean a formal policy or something as simple as a section in the employee handbook. Workplace policy includes support for breastfeeding employees, adequate break time for employees to express breast milk or breastfeed as needed, education of staff regarding the breastfeeding policy, and of supervisors regarding the basics of workplace support for breastfeeding employees, and the provision of place to breastfeed and express breast milk. Space. So a lactation room is a dedicated space for breastfeeding or pumping milk that offers privacy, comfort, and cleanliness. It should be equipped with essential amenities such as a comfortable chair, a table for equipment, an electrical outlet for breast pumps, a sink for hand washing. Might not be in the room, but at least close by. Ideally, the room should also be free from interruptions to provide a relaxing environment. A basic lactation room can be created with very little space, as small as a 4-foot by 5-foot room to accommodate a chair and a small table. For space, workplaces must have an appropriate number of lactation spaces relative to the number of breastfeeding employees. The appropriate number of lactation rooms depends on the size of the company, the number of female employees of childbearing age, and the number of buildings. Multiple sites should be provided if a site is not accessible for certain employees. So for lactation space, each lactation space must be an accessible location, be a private space other than a bathroom that is shielded from view and free from intrusion by coworkers and the public. A locking door is ideal, but if a locking door cannot be provided, there's some kind of door signage to prevent others from entering. Include a comfortable chair, include access to an electrical outlet or electrical source. Let's say you're out in the field, that could be a generator or battery pack. Have a small table or surface to support pumping equipment and breastfeeding supplies. Have her be located near clean refrigerator space for milk storage. Have or be located near a place to wash hands and clean pump equipment. So here at Brown County Public Health, we are introducing the Room to Grow funding. So the Room to Grow program will award lactation room furnishings like chairs, breastfeeding, refrigerator, tables, storage, etc. to 3 businesses that demonstrate a commitment to supporting breastfeeding employees. So priority will be given to businesses that serve or employ individuals experiencing poverty or from historically marginalized groups. This is due to them encountering significant barriers to breastfeeding, particularly when they are returning to work. These challenges can include a lack of workplace support, limited access to healthcare and breastfeeding resources, short or no maternity leave, cultural stigmas, and financial stress. As a result, these groups may struggle to establish and maintain breastfeeding. With this funding, businesses must commit to becoming breastfeeding friendly. If interested, I think Christine popped the link into the chat. please fill out an application. Even if you need some help with getting some furniture for your business, please apply. And then we'll be accepting applications for this funding until March 15th at midnight. And then once a workplace has completed all of the steps, they will be recognized as Brown County Breastfeeding Friendly Workplace. So this will include a framed certificate, window clings, social media shout-outs, an initial supply basket for the lactation room. The workplace will also be featured on our online infant feeding resource map, which is called Milk Map. And then if you're interested in becoming a breastfeeding friendly workplace, the first step is just to fill out an initial application or assessment so we can figure out where you are at and we can meet you where you're at and kind of help you support you through all of these steps. And that is all that I had.
Thank you very much, Becky. So looking in the chat and the Q&A, I don't see any questions at the moment. We do have some kind of questions that we had selected. So certainly if there's questions that you've thought of or want to add them in now, please feel free to do that. But in the meantime, the first question that I have is actually for Corey. So Corey, question for you on what protections are in place or maybe none for workers who have undocumented status and might fear kind of advocating for their own rights, or how does that look for someone in that situation?
Yeah, so just making the point that the nursing mother's protections apply to employees regardless of their immigration status. I want to make that point. But there's also in the Fair Labor Standards Act, there's some anti-retaliation provisions, protections, I'll say like that. So employers are prohibited from retaliating against employees for exercising their rights under the FLSA, which includes these nursing mothers protections. And that can be anything from being terminated illegally to asking a question about their rights to, even expressing an interest in knowing more about their rights. So it doesn't have to, all of those types of actions are going to be protected under the FLSA, regardless of immigration status.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That's great information to point out. So thank you so much. And Corey, another question for you. What are common, or I guess the most common challenges that you see employers facing when they're trying to comply with the different federal lactation laws?
A lot of the questions we got early on, and I'm going to remind everyone the first link. So under our 88866 number, the first link that I put in there, resource link I put in there, is to our Pump at Work page. And that Pump at Work page has has a link for FAQs by industry and some pre-recorded webinars on this topic by industry. And I say all that to answer your question, Christine, that transportation type employers, it's challenging for them to meet the requirements because of the nature of the job, the employees do. They're on the go pretty much. And so I would say, to answer your question, I would say a lot of times, employers express some frustration about in their industry, it's not so cut and dry putting these provisions, these protections in place. It's still their responsibility, obviously. But, I always told them all the outreach I do, just give us a call. Let's talk about it. That's what the 1866 number is for. It's not always easy. And the DOL realizes that if you're in certain industries, it's going to be a challenge. So by all means, don't try to wing it. If there's some questions and you need our guidance, just give us a call.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. And kind of one last question. I think you've kind of touched on this a little bit. Are there exceptions to the federal law for certain workplace types? I know we talked about the different parameters, but is there any certain workplace types that it doesn't apply to?
Yeah, it's still, none of that. I mean, could you be a little bit more specific, Christine? I think I know what you mean, but I want to make sure I do it.
Yeah, and Becky, maybe you have a little bit more insight on that one. It was one that we had to kind of come up with on that.
I think mostly are there any occupations where the Pump Act wouldn't cover, because I know it extended like for certain individuals like nurses and
Oh,
agricultural
gotcha.
workers. Are there any
Yeah.
occupations where it doesn't cover yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. When the Pump Act was passed, there was a delay with certain types of employees. I My brain is a little foggy on that. But what I'll do is, if you go to the Pump Act page, you'll get that information. I don't believe, though, I think we've surpassed that time frame when there was some delay as far as how it applied to certain types. I think transportation employees were in there. No, railroad employees were in there. But by and large, I don't think there's any more hesitate or delays. But don't take my word for it. Go to our Pump Act page and just get some confirmation that way. I don't want to say the wrong thing.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Corey. So, next question is for Becky. Can you share some examples of how lactation friendly workplace policies improve overall community health outcomes?
Yeah, so we kind of discussed during my presentation the different health benefits that breastfeeding has for both infants and mothers. So for infants, it leads to healthier babies. We know that breastfeeding helps lowers the risk of illness like ear infections and respiratory illness. Mothers also get that benefit with breastfeeding. They have reduced risk of breast and ovarian cancer, type 2 diabetes, and high blood pressure. This also translates usually to breastfed babies and mothers having fewer doctor visits, hospitalizations, and need for medications. This overall can reduce like healthcare costs for families, employers, and the entire community overall. And then when breastfeeding employees are supported, they take fewer sick days for themselves and for their children to take care of their children. This can improve workplace productivity and can strengthen the local economy.
Great. Thank you so much. The next question I have for you, Becky, is what are the most common barriers employees face when trying to continue breastfeeding, especially after returning to work?
So, employees who wish to continue breastfeeding after returning to work, they can face many barriers. One of the most common challenges may be that they lack a clean, private, and comfortable space for pumping. Time constraints are huge, as employees may not have sufficient or flexible breaks to pump when they need to. Especially in certain industries with like strict schedules or higher demands. And I feel like a lot of it comes from workplace culture and stigma as well. Employees often feel uncomfortable or stigmatized when asking for accommodations, particularly in environments where breastfeeding is not openly supported. And in some cases, employees can even face resistance from supervisors or coworkers who view pumping breaks as disruptive. I've heard that quite a bit with families that I've worked with. And then finally, the absence of a clear workplace policy or communication about breastfeeding can leave like employees uncertain about where to start and how to advocate for their needs. So having that clear policy where an employee can look at and be like, you are not following this policy, and these are the steps you need to take in order for it to meet these federal guidelines is very important.
Sounds great. So before I ask the next set of questions, I'm just going to put the evaluation into the chat. If you're able to take some time to be able to fill that out, helps us with for future webinars and improvements on that. And then if you are interested in a certification for attendance.
Just one kind of follow-up to that question that you asked me earlier, Christine, as far as the any types of employers. I went to our Pump at Work page and I pulled up some information. I don't think anyone in this room, in this virtual room, is representing an air carrier. But if so, let me know. I'll send you some information about air carriers. And I don't think anyone represents an air carrier, but let me know if you do. Just put something in the chat, email in the chat. I can send you some information.
Sounds great. And then I did put the evaluation form in the chat as well. And then last question is for both Corey and Becky, or whoever wants to answer, is how can employers balance the need for lactation breaks while maintaining productivity in the workplace?
I better let you go on that one, Becky.
So, employers can balance the need for lactation breaks while maintaining productivity. I think just by implementing flexible breaks and by integrating like lactation accommodations into the daily work schedule. I think another important piece of that is having clear communication and understanding from managers, along with like setting realistic expectations, can help with that. And then just encouraging like employers to have open communication with nursing employees to ensure that the breaks are taken at maybe mutually convenient times, but especially for the nursing parent, making sure to meet their needs is going to be the number one thing with that.
Yeah, and I would just echo, without getting into too much trouble, I would just echo what Becky said about the big piece of it is the communication part of it from a DOL standpoint. I talked about notice, the employer working together to making sure the requirements or the provisions are in place beforehand. That's a key part of the law. And then the law, actually, that undue hardship part of the component also represents the Department of Labor's acknowledgement that it's tough sometimes if you're a small business with the provisions. This can be a challenge. So that's the department's acknowledgement of that, and that 50 employee undue hardship test is there if you need it, and it applies.
Sounds great. So one last question to wrap up our day. What are some low cost or space efficient options for businesses with limited resources to help with this accommodation for space?
I haven't went to Amazon myself, but someone tells me about pop-up tents or something like that. I don't know. Okay, Becky's shaking her head. Yeah, I know nothing about them. Becky, if you know anything about them, please speak up. But I know I have heard employers bring those up.
Yeah, so I know of a couple of places, especially those in like agriculture, who are like outside, who don't have a specific room and who have nowhere to go, that they'll actually use pop-up tents to ensure that privacy and that the person has somewhere that they can go for pumping. Um, Pop-up tents, I've seen like partitions if you don't really have like the space to be able to have a separate room for the employee, having some kind of partition which would give them that privacy, and then some kind of like signage that would say please don't interrupt or please don't disturb. um, and like Corey said, for like outdoor field work, either a tent or like a mobile lactation, like even like a car, and then having some sort of like privacy shield, so they can go in there and pump, could be a simple solution for that. And then if you do have like an underutilized space, even like a super small space, like I said, it only takes like 4 feet by 5 feet to make a lactation room, and to make that comfortable, adding a comfortable chair and a table, making sure there's electrical outlet, um, and then just making that room feel inviting to like just having imagery of even like breastfeeding moms in there or anything like that can kind of help as well.
Perfect. Sounds great. Well, I personally don't have any other questions and I don't see any in the chat. So we are about 1 minute shy. So certainly if any other questions you have, feel free to type them in. Otherwise, we'll give it about 30 more seconds and then we will wrap up for today. So I'll give everyone just a last little bit here.
See, we had no airline carriers.
Correct. I didn't see anyone chime in on that. So. Well, perfect. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining today, and especially to Corey and Becky for presenting all this wonderful information for us. Like I said, I feel like I learned everything. I feel like I learned something new every time I delve into this topic. So, again, thank you so much for joining today, and we will be sending out all the different items at the end. So, thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.